Welcome to the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh's 2023 Affordable Housing Program, or AHP, and Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative webinar. Before I get started, I'd like to first get everyone oriented to this platform we're using. Please note that the session is being recorded. This webinar and the slide deck will be posted to the AHP website. All participants have been muted and videos are turned off. We've disabled the chat feature, but do encourage questions in the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Questions are viewable by all participants, and we'll answer questions as they arise. In the event that we're not able to answer your question, we'll follow up with a response after the presentation, and we should also have time for questions at the end of the presentation. We are very glad that so many of our member financial institutions and affordable housing developers are able to join us today. We really appreciate our partnership with you and the extremely important work that you do to support people and families in need of quality, affordable housing. This webinar is designed to give you the information needed to apply for the Federal Home Loan, or FHL, Bank's 2023 AHP and Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative subsidy. And because AHP is highly competitive, provide you with the resources to better understand our scoring priorities and the resources that FHL Bank makes available to you to submit a successful application. Here's today's agenda. The focus is on our scoring priorities and required documentation, feasibility, which is an important component of our review of your application, our voluntary housing grant initiative, and key dates for you to mark. The most important of which is August 9th at 5 p.m., which is when the applications are due. Joining us today are several of my colleagues. Megan Kreider, Community Investment Business Development Manager, will also be presenting. And behind the scenes are Kate Swanson, a Senior Manager, Community Products, and Zanette Naderi, Senior Community Investment Analyst. FHL Bank Pittsburgh is one of 11 banks established under the Federal Home Loan Bank Act of 1932. Our purpose is to increase the availability of credit for residential mortgage lending, as well as investment in housing and community development. Each FHL bank is independently owned and operated, privately capitalized, and organized as a cooperative. Together, we are the largest U.S. debt issuer behind the U.S. Treasury. The FHL Bank system is comprised of roughly 7,000 member institutions. FHL Bank Pittsburgh has roughly 300 members chartered in our district of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Our members borrow from FHL Bank when they need liquidity, and through this lending to members, we generate earnings, which are used to fund all of our community investment programs, including AHP and the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative. So our members are the drivers behind everything that we do. And AHP is funded solely by the activity with our members and does not use any tax dollars. We'll be covering AHP as well as the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative in depth today, but we want to make sure that you're all aware of our other community investment products. The First Front Door program is, like AHP, mandated by Congress, and it can help qualified first-time home buyers with down payments and closing costs. Our community lending program provides low-cost advances to our members to support economic development, such as financing for small businesses, infrastructure, and community development projects located in low and moderate income census tracts. Banking on Business is one of our voluntary products, and it helps eligible small businesses that lack sufficient equity or cash flow meet our members' lending standards. Our Blueprint Communities program provides local leaders the tools to develop a long-term revitalization strategy for their communities. And Home for Good provides grants to fund projects, programs, and activities that support those who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, working with the existing homeless service provider network in each state within our district. So before diving into AHP and the Voluntary Housing Grant, there are a few important items I'd like to highlight. First, our maximum subsidy has been increased to $750,000 to reflect our higher AHP amount available this year, approximately $20.3 million compared to $8.8 million awarded in 2022. We've also made several changes to scoring in the community stability, empowerment, low-income minority areas, and in-district point categories. These adjustments were made to better serve the region's housing needs, and we'll go over each scoring category in detail shortly. Also this year, we have $3 million available for the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative, which funds affordable housing within our district of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. So as I mentioned earlier, FHL Bank Pittsburgh funds AHP with 10% of our net income. It's a financing resource that helps our member financial institutions partner with developers to create affordable homes in local communities. AHP is a highly competitive process where members partner with developers to submit an application through our AHP online portal. A project may request up to $750,000 with a limit of $150,000 in AHP subsidy per unit. This year, again, we have about 20.3 million in AHP to award. Our FHL Bank Pittsburgh member financial institutions are crucial to AHP. You cannot submit an application to us without a member partner. It's really the AHP developer or the sponsor who completes the vast majority of the application, but members do have their own set of specific responsibilities. We're here to assist members with any questions you may have about the AHP process from the member perspective. If you're a member and submitting an application this year, you must ensure you have access to AHP Online because members must complete the final step in the submission process. Applications are due by 5 p.m. on August 9 this year, and we do not grant any extensions to the submission deadline. And our sponsors and developers are also crucial to AHP. Sponsors are responsible for ensuring that the application is completed in its entirety and that the member has enough time to complete their portion. It's also really important to make sure that somebody from your organization is available to answer any clarification questions we might have during our application review period, and make sure the questions are answered in a timely manner. If your project is awarded, it's the sponsor who is responsible for submitting funding requests, as well as maintaining application commitments throughout the project's lifecycle and post-completion compliance period. Consultants do not have access to projects once they're awarded. Another important responsibility is executing and recording subsidy retention agreements to secure the grant's affordability restrictions. Homeownership projects must use our real estate retention agreement, and rental projects must draft a security instrument, such as a mortgage and note, that incorporates our AHP or voluntary housing grant rider. Many types of affordable housing projects can be eligible for AHP and can be located in rural communities or large cities. No matter the type, size, location, or scale, all projects must comply with the AHP income requirements. AHP or voluntary housing grant funds can only go to support households at 80% or less of area median income using HUD guidelines for the area where the project is located. For example, a family of 4 in the Wilmington area in Delaware could have a household income of up to $84,300 per year based on 2022 income limits and still qualify for the program. There are 2 main components of the AHP process, pre and post-award. We'll cover in today's webinar the pre-award process, the competitive application scoring categories and documentation required, as well as key information about feasibility. Not covered today, but very important to be aware of, is the post-award disbursement process and long-term compliance and monitoring requirements based on project type. Visit our website or contact us for more information. All projects that receive an award will be subject to minimum draw provisions. This is important to know as AHP is a reimbursement of costs incurred. So for homeownership projects, disbursement occurs after the home is built and sold or rehabilitated. So make sure you take this requirement into account when planning any bridge or construction financing if needed. This slide covers the important documents and resources that are available to you and located on our website. The most important of these is the AHP implementation plan. This document sets the requirements and policy behind the scoring and feasibility underwriting completed by FHL Bank. There are also other resources available to you, including guides and forms for the application process. An overview of the application process is outlined here. You can already start to develop your application offline as a majority of the materials you need are available on our website. We do offer application assistance where you can schedule time with a member of our staff to review any questions that you have about AHP or the voluntary housing grant. You will be able to submit a request for application assistance between April 24th and May 19th. The AHP online system opens on June 28th, and applicants have until August 9th to submit their application. We then begin our review process and determine the awardees, which will be announced on December 14th. Here's a summary of the scoring categories and the points associated so you can review your project, review the requirements in the implementation plan, and determine what your requested score may be. We will review each of these categories today on the webinar, but be sure to thoroughly review the AHP guides, forms, and request application assistance. When you submit your application, you will answer questions, and those answers will determine your potential score. From there, we'll review your answers and the documentation submitted and compare it to the requirements in the implementation plan. We'll either maintain your score or the application may lose points for one of two reasons. First, if there's a technical problem with the documentation you submitted and it's not what was outlined in the implementation plan, or the project is not meeting the intent behind the scoring category. It's extremely important that all applicants understand that you must actively request the points in the AHP online system for any applicable scoring categories. If you don't request the points, we don't award the points. So when I say actively request, what I mean is within AHP Online, our application portal system, it'll ask you, do you wish to be considered for XYZ points? You have to answer yes, and then answer additional questions in the system, as well as upload any required documentation. So if you answer no, that's fine if it's not applicable to your project, but we won't be double checking and giving you credit if you did not specifically request points in a category. So I'll now go over each scoring category. Projects may receive 5 points for donated property if acquired by one of the three ways outlined on this slide. The only document eligible for consideration to support this requested category is the property conveyance form signed by an attorney and a sponsor. We may ask for other documentation like a supporting deed or sales agreement, but without a properly executed property conveyance form, a project will not be considered for these points. 5 points may be awarded to projects that have integral involvement or ownership interest by a qualified organization such as a nonprofit or a local housing authority. There's a specific form required for this category to be considered for points, and that is the sponsorship by qualifying organization form, which must be signed by the sponsor, an attorney, and the qualified organization if that organization is different from the sponsor. Additional supporting documentation will be requested in AHP Online, such as an organization's 501c3 determination, partnership agreements, articles of incorporation, or other documentation that applies to your project to demonstrate the organization's qualified status. Applications may receive up to 20 points for targeting. More points are attributed to projects that reserve a higher number of units to households with lower incomes. There are different calculations for the score for homeownership versus rental projects. At application, no documentation is required for this category, except for projects that are rental rehabilitation that are currently occupied, in which case you'll have to submit your rent roll using our tenant income workbook. Income is one of the foundations of the affordable housing program. It's really important to understand how and when to qualify. Our income guidelines are on our website, and the times of determination of qualification, which differs based on your project type, are listed here on this slide. Currently occupied rental projects may have different timing requirements for income qualification, depending on whether or not there is an approved relocation plan as part of this project. So definitely recommend requesting application assistance or contacting us if you have questions about this particular requirement. Reserving units for individuals facing homelessness is a high scoring priority for us. Up to 8 points may be awarded to eligible projects. If 50% or more of units are reserved for homeless households, 8 points are awarded. If less than 50%, but above the minimum of 20% are reserved, then 4 points are awarded. At application, no documentation is required for this category, but it will be required at disbursement for homeownership projects or monitoring for rental projects. Make sure you refer to our definition of homelessness in our implementation plan. The populations with special needs or military veterans scoring category is structured similarly to housing for homeless populations. The more units reserved for individuals with special needs or military veterans, the more points to a project. Either 4 or 8 points can be awarded based on the percentage reserved. Again, no documentation is required at application, but will be required for applicable households at disbursement or monitoring. Make sure you refer to the definitions for this category in the implementation plan. Projects that have at least 75% of sites located in rural areas, as defined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, may be eligible for 5 points. There are specific documents required for this. Applicants who already know all their project sites have a choice between providing the certification form for all applicable site addresses that's signed by a USDA representative, or they can use the USDA's website to print out a form for each qualifying address. Projects with unknown sites committing to at least 75% of those sites ultimately qualifying as rural must provide the certification form. In that case, a website printout won't be accepted. In an effort to support housing for the most cost-burdened, rental projects that will reserve at least 20% of the project's total units for extremely low-income households, which is 30% or less of the area median income, may receive 4 points. Documentation of income for the project is extremely important and will be requested at various times throughout the project's life cycle. Projects that not only provide housing, but have expansive programs or services that empower the project's residents may receive up to 6 points. Applicants may request as many points as are applicable, but a maximum of 6 can be awarded. For each service, the project will require a separate Empowerment Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, is required. This MOU certifies that the sponsor and the service provider commit to the service for the residents. Projects that help to stabilize the local community may receive up to 16 points. There are 6 different subcategories that make up this overarching scoring category. The first is community planning. 3 points may be awarded if the project has the majority or 75% of its sites located within an eligible plan's bounds and must meet targeted priorities as outlined within that plan. Plans must be approved or have been updated within the past 10 years. And to receive points in this category, you must complete and submit the community planning certification form and upload with your application. A project that is rehabilitating existing properties may receive 3 points. Owner-occupied rehabilitation projects fit into this category, and other types of projects that may be considered eligible are rental rehabilitation or for sale homeownership rehabilitation, as long as at least 75% of units are rehabilitated, and the hard rehab costs must be greater than $25,000 per unit. This number is derived from the AHP financial feasibility workbook that you submit with your application. No other documentation is required at application for this category. If a property is of historic significance as defined by the project's State Historical Preservation Office, 2 points may be awarded with a properly executed property of historic significance form. The project must also have hard rehabilitation costs per unit greater than $25,000. For any Pennsylvania project, please refer to our AHP application guide, which will be available in advance of the round opening on June 28th. For Pennsylvania State Historical Preservation Offices, because they have some specific form submission requirements. You can also request application assistance or reach out to us if you have questions on that. 5 points may be awarded to rental projects that are preserving existing subsidized housing. These projects must be within 2 years of permitted repayment or expiration of a restricted use requirement. The preserved units must be at least 75% of the total project, and the hard rehab costs must be greater than $10,000 per unit. And there's a preservation of existing subsidized housing form that needs to be submitted for this category, and that must be signed by the project's original funders. For owner-occupied rehabilitation, up to 10 points may be awarded. Rural owner-occupied rehab projects are eligible for 10 points, and other owner-occupied rehab projects are eligible for 8 points. Projects may receive points for both this category and the rehab of existing properties category. And no documents are required for this category, but please note that documents are required for the rural eligibility as discussed earlier. So you must receive the rural points in order to receive the rural owner-occupied rehab points. For sale, owner-occupied, and rental projects, and rental projects is a new addition of eligibility for this category, that have an affordability period of at least 30 years and include the required elements on this slide may be eligible for 5 points. The sustained affordability form is required to be signed and certified by the sponsor, indicating that the project is part of a shared equity model or community land trust that includes these aspects. In an effort to support development in low-income minority areas, which have great affordable housing needs, projects may receive 4 points if located in a low-income minority area, as determined by FHL Bank Pittsburgh. At least 75% of the property census tracts must be located within eligible areas, and a list of eligible tracts is available on our website. Please note that this list has changed from prior years to reflect the most recent decennial census. Another requirement to be considered for points is that the project also must meet the community planning criteria under community stability, which was previously covered. So you cannot receive points for the low-income minority areas category if you do not request and receive community planning points. The project requesting low-income minority areas points should submit the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, or FFIEC, verification of the project census tract for all qualifying addresses using either the year 2022 or 2023. It's important to select one of these years when pulling this information for each qualifying address to align with the census tracts in our list of eligible areas, because that information is based on the most recent decennial census. For any sites unknown, the sponsor must certify in AHP Online that the project will meet these requirements. Projects that receive points for the low-income minority area category and are either creating new homeownership for sale opportunities in these qualified areas may receive 6 points, and then rehab of existing owner-occupied properties may receive 3 points. This is a change from last year. Previously, owner-occupied rehabilitation was not eligible for this category. And no documentation is required for this specific category, but it's going to be driven on your application type and the answers and documentation submitted for the low-income minority area scoring category. The final category to review is residential economic diversity, which allows for projects to request points if at least 75% of the project's properties are located in census tracts with a median family income greater than or equal to 100% of area median income as published by FFIEC. Documentation to be submitted with application includes the FFIEC census tract for all qualifying addresses with the most current census demographic information that shows the tract's median income. An example of that documentation that you need to submit is on this slide. 2022 year data must be used, as the income data for 2023 is not yet available. So note that in this case, the tract's median family income is above 100%, and so this would be considered eligible. And the final category for review is projects in FHL Bank Pittsburgh's district. So if you're completing a project located within Pennsylvania or West Virginia, you are eligible for 5 points. Projects in Delaware are eligible for 9 points. Now, applicants must actively request consideration for these points by answering yes, you wish to be considered. Again, FHL Bank Pittsburgh as policy does not award points if an application did not request them. As mentioned before, even though a project may request points, points are not guaranteed, and they're subject for removal by FHL Bank Pittsburgh as we determine the final score. Some common mistakes we see on applications that result in losing points are listed on this slide. It's critical to slow down, plan ahead, and thoroughly review the implementation plan, seek application assistance, and use your resources. We strongly recommend having another set of eyes review the documentation prior to submitting the application to ensure that you've submitted all the required elements as outlined in the implementation plan and actively requested the points that you want us to consider for your application. We make determinations based on the information you provide within the online application. If documents are unclear, forms are missing, signatures are missing, or costs are unclear, it may negatively affect the application. So it's really important to review all the resources that we provide to make sure that your application is as competitive as possible. Megan Kreider will be covering feasibility next.
Thank you, Rhiannon, and hi, everyone. Really a lot of information being provided during this webinar, and what I really want to stress during this portion is that feasibility is equally as important as scoring. So a lot of times when I'm out there talking with folks that are looking at doing affordable housing projects, they get very caught up in the scoring component of the application process, that the feasibility components are sometimes overlooked. But you really do need both. You need to be successful at both to get an award. So every year there are a few applications that score competitively high enough for us to consider them for funding. But during our feasibility underwriting process, those applications are not passing this portion of the review, and therefore they do not receive an award. Last year, this affected 4 different projects. Upon our feasibility review, we may deem the project unfeasible. It could be that we reduce the subsidy request or even the units being proposed as part of the project, or we may add conditions that must be satisfied prior to the release of any committed funding. So I want to just mention and go over our feasibility review process at a high level, and everything is outlined in the implementation plan. So be sure to take a look at that. But during our feasibility review, we are going to look at your project and we're going to compare it to those specific feasibility criteria that's outlined in the implementation plan. And we only complete a feasibility review on the highest scoring projects in the competitive running for the funding. We understand the additional information request can be a lot, but this information is what we really need to know and understand the nuances of your project and ensure the best use of the AHP dollars. So we ask that you respond as thoroughly and as quickly as possible. And while we don't come back for a correction period during our scoring review process, you will have the opportunity to address feasibility questions that we may have. So for example, if you are outside of one of our guidelines, you should be prepared to respond back to us with backup documentation and have that discussion with us to help us understand those particular nuances. And remember, being outside of a feasibility guideline does not necessarily mean that your project is ineligible, but it will certainly mean that we're going to ask some questions about it to get some understanding and familiarity from your perspective. So as the project sponsor, understanding the project's feasibility analysis as part of your application submission process, meaning you should really be viewing your projects through our guidelines and reviewing the feasibility guidelines tab that is located within the financial feasibility workbooks that we have available. Ultimately, it is the decision of FHL Bank to make exceptions to any of those feasibility guidelines with the proper justification. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, projects must score competitively and pass feasibility to be awarded an AHP commitment. So the bank will evaluate completing applications using those guidelines, as I mentioned, in our implementation plan. We use these as a benchmark for evaluating projects during application funding rounds. And here are some of those things that we take a look at. So need for subsidy. Questions like, are your costs reasonable? Have you secured sources to fund your project? Is there a gap that the two could fill, or does AHP need to fill it? Cost reasonableness. How did you determine costs for your project? Are they reasonable? Do they meet our thresholds? We use cost reasonableness guidelines and we establish those on our website in advance of the funding round to help make that decision whether or not the costs are reasonable. Do you have the ability to proceed? We will evaluate a project's ability to draw or secure funds within 12 months of the award. So we're going to be taking a look at site control, your zoning clearances, environmental issues, and making sure that none of these are really going to prevent you and the project from progressing forward in a timely fashion. We'll assess market demand. Homeownership projects with 12 or more units and rental projects with 20 or more units must have a market study. So for more information, it is detailed on the requirements based on your unit type, the configuration, and who you're serving as to whether or not a market study is required. But do know that all applications must demonstrate market demand, and if you're exempt, you'll still need to provide documentation to explain as such. And sponsor capacity. We'll evaluate the capacity of sponsors and the whole development team in completing and operating the proposed project. Sponsors must explain the development team's experience with affordable housing development as part of the application process, and we outline that on the sponsor experience form. All projects are required to be completed within 4 years, and they must incur eligible costs and then draw down on the grant within 2 years to maintain compliance with our policies. So your experience form really should explain how you're going to meet these specific timelines. Development teams with limited experience or sponsors with current compliance issues may be contacted by us for further information to confirm capacity to complete the project. And then if awarded, projects kind of falling into this category, you may be conditioned to work with an experienced co-developer or be restricted from drawing down funds until certain project milestones are met. So the sponsors, if you fall into this category, will be informed of any such conditions prior to making the award so that you have that advance notice. As outlined in the implementation plan, sponsors with limited capacity may have your subsidy request reduced or unit count reduced. It is the sole discretion of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh once we receive the full picture as part of underwriting the application process. And the sponsor will be informed of any reductions as well prior to making the award. I want to talk about some common feasibility issues that we see each round. One is unexplained high costs that are outside of our cost reasonableness guidelines. So really recommend that you proactively compare your costs to our thresholds and be able to explain how your project and your costs and specifically how they are or are not meeting those guidelines based on your project type and the area where it's being developed. Sometimes we don't see our true need for the subsidy being requested based on the financials being presented to us. All projects must have a gap. Or for example, if there's a project with a related party transaction, we will need to ensure that there is no excess profit being made that could be used to support the project, therefore removing the need for the AHP subsidy. Sometimes projects have unexplained feasibility guideline issues. So if you can't provide a reasonable explanation for something outside of our feasibility guidelines, then we can't approve it. So it's really important to be prepared to explain any project costs that don't meet our guidelines outlined in the implementation plan. Sometimes projects aren't ready to proceed. It might be a good idea and you have a great concept, but it's not ready to move forward and draw down on those funds that are incurred because of the 12-month approval requirement that we have. This could be because you're still tied up with site control issues, or maybe you have any zoning issues that you're trying to work out and the timeline isn't matching up. So make sure you're prepared to answer any questions that we have in that space. Changing financials are also a red flag for us. It makes us question if the project is fully vetted and ready to move forward. And rental projects need to demonstrate financial viability for at least 15 years. So does your project have the substantial cash flow to support itself throughout its compliance period? We recommend that you upload your financial feasibility workbook early on in the application process once the system opens. Once you do that, you're going to open up a whole nother aspect of the system with questions specifically related to your project and your financials as you have them outlined. So you'll have that opportunity then, have an advanced look at that to be prepared to answer any of those questions in the application. So continuing and expanding on, how do you prepare for feasibility? The number one way is to know your project, which I'm sure you do, but how does your project relate to our AHP feasibility guidelines? So have that understanding of how they tick and tie together. We've also touched on each one of these points already, but really having your team assembled, they're there and ready to respond to the feasibility reviewer questions, have your documentation organized and ready so that it's when it's requested by us at the bank, you'll have it at your fingertips. So this is really going to help set you up for success as an applicant. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Rhiannon, who will get into key dates to keep in mind for this year. And we also want to overview the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative.
Thank you, Megan. Some of you might be wondering, what is the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative? So this year, we are providing an additional $3 million through the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative as a continuation of what we offered in 2022. And that's to support affordable housing development throughout the bank's district, which includes projects located in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. These funds can support the same types of projects under the Affordable Housing Program and can request the same limits as $750,000 per project with a $150,000 per unit limit. There are some differences between AHP and the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative. Whereas AHP is required by statute and the amounts available fluctuate each year based on the bank's prior year earnings, that 10% of net income. The Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative is a discretionary offering of $3 million. AHP is eligible for projects anywhere that our members do business, whereas the Voluntary Housing Grant is only available for projects in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Under the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative, applications in Pennsylvania and West Virginia have a 1 project award minimum per state, and Delaware has a 2 project minimum allocation. This is a little different from last year, so make sure that you read the Voluntary Housing Grant Program Manual for this year, which goes over those differences in a little more detail. If there are not enough projects within a specific state to fund the minimum, then the remaining amount will be used to fund other in-district projects. Projects awarded through the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative will follow the same scoring rules and feasibility guidelines that we covered earlier in today's webinar. Monitoring requirements will be similar with some exceptions, including the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative has its own version of the subsidy agreement to execute. And there are different versions of the retention documents, although the terms remain the same. A 15-year retention period for rental projects and 5 years for owner-occupied for sale projects. And just as a reminder, owner-occupied rehabilitation does not have a retention requirement for either AHP or the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative. And long-term monitoring for projects that receive voluntary housing grant funds will be limited to an annual certification of compliance. To apply for the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative, we've made the process as streamlined as possible. So anyone wishing to be considered for the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative must apply through the statutory AHP online application process. All projects will be considered for AHP until the AHP subsidy runs out. And then remaining projects that do not competitively score under AHP that are located within the bank's district will be considered for the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative. So there's no separate application process for the Voluntary Housing Grant. This slide has some key dates for you all to be aware of, and the most important takeaway on this slide is to start as soon as possible. We have information already available on our website, so you can start, read the implementation plan, fill out the forms, and make sure that you're reaching out to attorneys, other organizations who you might need to help fill out those forms, get appropriate signatures, etc. It's also really important to identify a member financial institution to talk about your potential projects or request assistance if you're a member and you want to find a sponsor. We do have a member sponsor match form on our website that you can fill out if you don't already have a contact. As mentioned earlier, the application assistance request window will open on April 24th. This is when you can schedule time with a member of our staff to discuss your specific application and questions you have on scoring and feasibility. And if you applied last year and were unsuccessful and plan on resubmitting your application, you can also discuss how to improve that application during this time. So highly, highly recommend scheduling an application assistance call because it's a great opportunity to get all your detailed questions answered in a one-on-one conversation. So the application assistance request window opens on April 24th and then closes on May 19th. So you must submit your request no later than May 19th. And appointments are scheduled on a first come, first served basis. And outside of the application assistance calls, we are not able to answer any questions related to scoring and feasibility. So again, super important to schedule an application assistance call. However, we're always available during business hours for any technical issues you may encounter, such as logging onto the system or trouble uploading documents. On June 28th, our AHP online system will open for application input, and then applications are due on August 9th. And on December 14th, we'll make award announcements for both the Affordable Housing Program and the Voluntary Housing Grant Initiative. So I mentioned that we have several forums and other resources available. To access those, you can go to our website and click on the image that says AHP Forms and Resources. It's going to be the top left-hand side of the AHP page on our FHL Bank website. When you click on that image, you'll be directed to this page that has all of our forums, guides, and webinars. So the two sections that you're going to be most interested in as an applicant are AHP application attachments and AHP guides and webinars and applying for AHP funding. And then we also recommend taking a look at our project monitoring and reporting requirements and our using AHP funding sections too, because that's going to give you a little bit more detail on the post-award process. And of course, if you have any questions, you can also reach out to a member of staff. It's really important to review all the information that we already have on our website before your scheduled application assistance appointment to make sure that you have a productive conversation with our staff about your application's competitiveness. When you're filling out the application request form, you're going to be asked to identify some specific questions and do a pre-scoring of your application. So you'll need to check out all these resources in order to complete that properly and get the most of that out of that conversation. The most important next steps for applicants are to register in the AHP online system if you don't already have a username and password, or if you're a member and you have access to online banking, check and make sure that you also have access to AHP. And again, you can reach out to a member of staff and we can help you figure that out. You also want to make sure that you're reviewing all those resources, such as the implementation plan, and finding a member financial institution or a sponsor partner to match with. You should also be reviewing the application forms that you're going to have to submit as part of your application. And then we also have a guide to application input to help you go through that online process. So that guide lists all of the questions that you're going to be asked in the AHP online system so that you can go ahead and start prepping all of your answers in advance of June 28th to get a head start on the application. And of course, please request application assistance between April 24th and May 19th to make sure that you're using all of those resources that we make available. Of course, getting started early, you can never start too early. Check out all the resources, contact us if you have questions, because we know that the application can take some time to fill out and we want to make sure that you're prepared to complete it successfully. Our contact information is on this slide. So you have some email addresses and phone numbers for key contacts here. And again, the slide deck is going to be available on our website, so you'll have that info there. We do strongly recommend that you email the general AHP at FHLB-PGH.com email, though, because multiple staff regularly monitor this inbox. So you'll probably get an answer. You may get an answer more quickly with that email. So with that, we're going to open up for questions. So in the question and answer box, I'll be going through some of the questions there that have not been already answered. So I see that we have a question about a project that's currently under construction with a deferred developer fee. Would that qualify as a funding gap that could be funded by FHL Bank Pittsburgh? Probably. I mean, we would have some questions about that. This is definitely the kind of question that you would want to request an application assistance call for. We do have a requirement that your project the construction should not be complete by the time an award is made. So it would depend on kind of how far under construction you are. So yeah, please contact us and request an application assistance call so we can dig into some of the details there. All right. So yeah, we have some questions about tax credits. If you are an application that is requesting 9% tax credits, do you already have to have those tax credits to be considered ready to proceed? Not necessarily. We at FHL Bank Pittsburgh and the Affordable Housing Program, where we could be comfortable being the first funder in, but you would need to provide some information about your timeline there, and we would want to make sure that you demonstrate that you'd be able to have all your funding committed within 1 year of award. So that's what we're looking for, is that you're going to have all your pending financial commitments all closed within a year. Right. Yeah, so we have a few questions on the scoring ranges for successful AHP and voluntary housing grant in the last round. So yeah, we list this information on just for future reference, we have this information on our website as well, so you can always access it there. But for the Affordable Housing Program, last year, the highest score was 79 and the lowest was 68. But I do want to caveat that we've changed our scoring categories this year. So those scores are not necessarily going to be reflective of what's going to be a competitive score this year. And also last year, we awarded 8.8 million in AHP, whereas in this year we have 20.3 million available. So that difference in subsidy amount available is also going to affect competitive scores. All right. We also have some questions about why would Delaware receive more points than an application in Pennsylvania? And Megan, I think, would you be okay answering this question?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. So, for folks who are not familiar, our implementation plan is governed by our Affordable Housing Advisory Council, which is made up of 15 key leaders throughout our 3 states, and they help guide and set the policy, as well as our board of directors. So whenever we take a look at each funding round, we have set up a fair and equitable scoring among all of our states that we serve, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and West Virginia, as well as specific housing outcomes that are related to priority needs that have been demonstrated through a housing needs assessment that we completed in 2020. So that is how we generate our scoring to determine where we're going to prioritize that funding. So when we take a look at equitable scoring across our 3 states, it was quite apparent that Delaware was going to need additional points to remain competitive in the general fund. And so we provided the additional points needed there to ensure those equitable scoring metrics. So when we removed the points under the empowerment, empowerment is very important to projects. It's by reducing those points, we are still advocating for providing empowerment services to projects. Majority of applicants are doing that. So we don't want to see that discontinued, but the vast majority of applications have a very healthy empowerment services supporting individuals that are living in those projects. Pennsylvania, West Virginia, you are still receiving the competitive points of 5 additional points under that under the in-district scoring category, as well as opportunity under our voluntary housing grant. So that just speaks to some of the recent changes approved by our council and our board. And we do make scoring tweaks every year as a result of the outcomes that we are meeting, as I mentioned earlier. So thank you for that question. And if you have any additional questions in this space, I encourage you to speak with our staff in a application assistance and requesting that in the timeline that we have to request that. So thanks, Rhiannon.
Thanks, Megan. I also want to note that, so we're getting some questions that are a little project specific. So if we don't answer those, we will be following up with you after this. So your question is not being ignored. We're just going to follow up and request a little more information to make sure that we're getting you the right answer. I do see a question about our First Front Door program, asking if that's something that's required for owner occupied projects. So that's actually it's a set aside of the affordable housing program. It has a separate funding round. So it should be considered separate from this affordable housing program process that we discussed today. And if you have more questions about that, please reach out to us. But no, it's not anything that you would have to build into the project budget. And we have lots of info on the First Front Door program, including some other recorded webinars. So we'll be happy to send that your way if that would be helpful. We also have a question about when the 2023 guides will be available. So most of our forms are available on the website today, and we do have a guide that includes all the input fields that are in our AHP application. Now we also have some guides that give a little more context to how to answer questions and what kind of documentation you need to submit. Those guides will be available no later than June 28th, which is when our AHP online system opens. But you have enough with the implementation plan and the forms to get started, and as well as all the questions that are actually going to be in that application. We also have a question about what kind of documentation is going to be required for a sponsor organization. So that depends. First of all, every sponsor is going to have to submit a sponsor experience form, just outlining what kind of experience you have and what kind of experience your development team has with affordable housing. So you'll need to submit that. And then we're going to want to see some kind of documentation that shows if you're applying for sponsorship by nonprofit points, what your organizational structure looks like. And that's going to depend on the organization, but typically it's going to be a 501c3, documentation of your 501c3 status. So again, this is really depends on what kind of organization you are. So please reach out to us if you're not exactly sure what you're going to have to submit, and we'll be able to help you. And there was a related question to that. If you're submitting financial statements, do they need to be audited? So we don't always request financial statements, but in some cases we do, especially if you're a newer or like a sponsor that hasn't used affordable housing funds before. We probably are going to request some kind of documentation as to the financial health of your organization. And we always prefer audited financial statements, but again, this is it's going to be really dependent on kind of your project specifics, organization specifics. And I definitely encourage you to schedule an application assistance call to get a little more detail on that if you have concerns. All right. So we also have a question on, will FHLB fund projects with RACP funding committed? We don't have any stipulations or requirements on that kind of funding. So I think for this, if you have any questions on other funding sources and how they tie into the affordable housing program, again, that's a good kind of like one-on-one question, but we typically don't have any restrictions on what other kind of funding is involved in your total development costs. So we have a question on, how can you request application assistance. And, what if you know that you want assistance, but you're not really sure what your questions are yet? So anyone can request application assistance starting April 24th through May 19th. And we're going to have that application assistance form on our website on April 24th. It's going to ask you for some info and details about your project. And it's also going to guide you to resources to review, like this webinar, available guides, the implementation plan, and forms. So, and it does ask for specific questions. So if you don't know what your questions are yet, you will have to wait until you've determined those. Because typically on the calls, we're not able to answer questions that aren't on the form. That's why we encourage you to, review all the forms, etc., right away. As you start reviewing the implementation plan, I promise you will have questions. So I think that it's definitely worth filling out that form. And again, if you're not sure how to fill out that form, send us an email, give us a call, and we can help you out, help you determine some questions that you might want to ask.
Hey, Rhiannon, someone had a question about if they can't find their password or their user ID, how should they get started?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you can't find your user ID or you need to get someone registered, on our website, we have a sponsor registration guide, and there's separately instructions for members who need to register with the Affordable Housing Program. If you're already registered, then don't register again. So if you're not sure, maybe you used the Affordable Housing Program a few years ago and you're not sure if you still have a password or login, just email us, ahp@fhlbpgh.com for assistance, or call us and we'll be able to determine if you have a login and reset your password. And again, super important, make sure that you can access the system early on, because sometimes it can take a while to figure out these login issues. So we encourage you to just make sure to get any questions related to logging in as early as possible. So thanks everyone for attending the webinar today. We're going to post the recording as well as the slide deck on our website. Forms are already available, and then the application assistance form is going to be available on April 24th, and we'll be sending an email out to everyone to remind you that that's available as well. So thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.